It has been noted by many other writers, that today when a loved one passes over, we celebrate their life, often avoiding or glossing over the distressing fact that they have died, almost as if it would be rude to mention it. Not so our Victorian ancestors, they positively revelled in rituals that celebrated death. This was unsurprising as it was all around them. Poverty, incurable diseases, and insanitary housing meant that had you lived in early Victorian England, the 1830s and 40s, you would have been lucky to make it to your late 30s, while a fifth of children born at that time would not reach the age of 5. Yet despite these grim statistics, the Victorian fondness for funerals and funeral rituals grew out of more than just a pragmatic realization that they would undoubtedly be attending an awful lot of them. It was far more than that. The spiritual and religious beliefs of Victorians lead them to the view that death was something to prepare for, and that the dead should be remembered, not just in their living but in the manner of their passing. To have a good death was important, to settle one's affairs not only materially, but spiritually as well, in preparation for the transition into the next phase of the soul's existence. One aspect of this tradition which can seem macabre and slightly voyeuristic to the modern eye, is that of post-mortem photography. But creating images of the dead was not invented in the 19th century. Preserving the memory of the dead has a long history, and prehistory. From the monumental, think pyramids, mausoleums and tombs, to the personal and portable, such as jewelry and images. While we might find it odd to want an image of a loved one in death, in the past it was not unheard of. In the 17th century, when the beautiful Venetia Stanley, Lady Digby, died unexpectedly in her sleep, her distraught husband had her final portrait painted, post-mortem, by none other than Sir Anthony van Dyck. But such extravagant memento mori, translated as remember that you have to die, were the preserve of the wealthy upper classes, until, that is, the advent of photography. Post-mortem photography was popular in the UK, USA, and Europe in the mid-19th century, its popularity peaking in the 1860s and 70s. Its rise began in the 1840s with the birth of photography. Louis Daguerre, one of the fathers of photography, developed his eponymous daguerreotype in 1839. Daguerreotype images were produced on treated silver-plated copper sheets, protected by glass. The images are strange to look at and change from positive to negative, depending on the angle. The process was expensive and time-consuming. It could take up to 15 minutes to develop an exposure, and the images created were fragile, often having to be protected in cases or frames. Nevertheless, it wasn't long before they were being used to capture the likenesses of the deceased. In 1850 the cheaper embertype method superseded the daguerreotype. This process created a positive image on glass. As with the daguerreotype, the finished product was fragile and each image was unique and could only be reproduced by the camera. The 1860s and 1870s brought the tintype photograph to prominence, which as the name suggested was created on a thin sheet of metal. This method easy to produce and was popular with itinerant photographers on the move. So the photographer was able to extend beyond the studio setting to other arenas, such the open battlefield, or the private deathbed. The biggest revolution in democratizing photography was the carte de visite method, patented by André-Adolphe Eugène d'Astieri in 1854. His method produced small images made up of albumen prints on card. The truly revolutionary aspect of this method was that he developed a way of producing up to 8 negatives on one plate, thereby driving down costs. This meant that images could more easily be shared amongst family and friends. With post-mortem images, it allowed family members who were not able to be present at the deathbed or funeral, to have a final image of their loved one. In the early and mid-Victorian period, evangelical Christianity had a strong influence on attitudes towards death and dying. Professor Sir Richard Evans noted in his lecture The Victorians, Life and Death, that the emphasis was on a good death, ideally a peaceful and gentle transition into the afterlife, witnessed by family and friends. Where a deathbed struggle with fever or delusion occurred, it could be seen as a metaphor for the Christian struggle for redemption. Post-mortem photography represents part of this tradition, offering a memento mori, an object of reflection to the yet living, as well as, more prosaically, providing symbol of social status because not everyone could afford them. That is not to say that all Victorians were comfortable with the idea of snapping images the dearly departed, far from it. As Catherine Arnold notes in Necropolis, photographic images such fading away, created by Henry Peach Robinson in 1858, which used actors to depict the death of a beautiful young girl, were not universally praised. Unlike the tasteful and idealized deathbed scenes depicted in oils, the disturbing intimacy and realism created by the medium of photography seem to intrude on the very personal and private realm of grief. However, there seems to be a strong argument against the possibility that the Brady stand, or any other stand, even combined with wires, could have ever actually support the dead weight, pardon the pun, of a corpse, in anything approaching a natural manner. In the case of Fading Away, the image was saved from censure when Prince Albert bought a copy, thereby ensuring its popular appeal. It's a good thing he liked images of deathbeds, because Queen Victoria commissioned both a painting and a photograph of him on his own deathbed, in 1861. These images are available to view in the Royal Collection, see links at the end of this article. Styles of post-mortem photography ranged throughout the 19th century and varied from the UK and Europe to the USA. Broadly speaking, the earlier images focused on headshots and close ups, with the subject apparently asleep. Later more naturalist poses were adopted where the subject was posed as if in life, and later still the funeral group, with the family gathered round for one last photo with the dearly departed in their coffin, became popular. However, the significant difference between these images and images such as Fading Away, is that post-mortem photography was intended to be viewed in the private sphere, whereas Peach Robinson's staged image was clearly for public consumption. So, why did the Victorians do it? Why have a stranger come into your home, while you are grieving, and interfere with your loved one, simply in order to take a photo? Well, it seems that a number of factors collided to produce the right climate for it. Evangelical Christianity, with its concept of the good death, technological developments, and the rise of the middle classes, along with a large dash of Victorian morbidity. In some cases, these images may have been the only images taken of the individual. This is particularly possible with images of babies and young children. And, practically speaking, they were a way of sharing the death of a loved one with relatives unable to attend the actual deathbed. However, as well as a personal remembrance of the individual, they were also used as a way to reflect upon death, demonstrating Victorian preoccupations with both piety and morbidity. The images allowed for a dialogue between the living and the dead, a reconciliation that the viewer too will die. A Victorian viewing these images would have been able to read them in a very different way than we do now, identifying the spiritual narrative, shared social values, the moral lessons in these images. Joe Smoke, writing in Beyond the Dark Veil, suggested that as well as a moral and spiritual purpose, Memento Mori can also be seen as expressing class goals by equating taste and beauty as metaphors for status and style. After all, these images were often displayed in beautiful and expensive frames or jeweled cases, and not everyone could afford them. He concluded that post-mortem photography successfully encompassed both the spiritual and the consumerist nature of Victorian society, stating that they symbolized tangibility by stretching the inevitability of human decay into the future by investing memory into materials of great physicality. Today, the internet is flooded with images purporting to be Victorian post-mortem photographs. Sometimes a sort of checklist is deployed to identify them, and although one can probably assume that an individual depicted in a coffin is almost certainly dead, other signs such as closed or painted eyes, blank expressions, visible standing frames, or strange posture aren't necessarily proof positive of a post-mortem photograph. The tradition of depicting the deceased as though living, often accompanied by living relatives and children, has created even more difficulty in differentiating between what may simply be an awkward and uncomfortable-looking living individual and a posed corpse. She appears notably sharper than her living parents, who appear slightly blurred. Even when developments in photography led to reduced exposure times, it was still difficult to remain still during the process, unless of course, you were dead. This was such a problem that the living were often supported with apparatus, such as a Brady stand. The use of these stands has led to what some call the myth of the standing corpse, whereby any images of a slightly suspect individual, where a stand is visible, may be identified as post-mortem, a particular problem on commercial selling sites. It has been said that the advent of the Kodak box brownie, allowing families to document entire lives from birth to death, caused the post-mortem photograph to fall out of favor, but there was more to its decline than technical innovation. By the end of the Victorian period and beginning of the Edwardian, there was a fundamental shift in attitudes to death. For one, evangelical Christianity, with its particular interpretation of the good death, had waned. By the Edwardian period a good death had transformed into one more familiar to us today, a death without suffering or one that took the subject unawares, such as in their sleep. As such, conversations about death and dying became less acceptable than they had been in the early and mid-Victorian periods. Catastrophic conflicts such as the First World War, also played their part in changing attitudes. Such brutal conflicts took death away from the intimate family setting, and while death could be presented as a patriotic sacrifice to the state, it often occurred violently, or too far from home to allow for a photographic memento mori to be either desirable or practically possible. In this modern world, where we have become desensitized to the graphic images of death reported in the media, we have shut death out, except in its most extreme and impersonal form. In contrast, these quiet, contemplative and very personal images of the dead offer us the opportunity to open a dialogue with death, and to reflect on that great leveler. And of course, they also provide an ever so gentle reminder that we too will die.